Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Erik Werker. Hello, Professor Erik. How are you
Hi,
doing?
Lipton. How are you?
I'm great. So I'm really interested in the resource curse. Recently, I interviewed a graduate student to talk about the resource curse, and now you're my second guest. In 2020, you produced a piece for the
Hmm.
Brookings Institute titled Are Natural Resources a Curse, a Blessing, or a Double-Edged Sword? And this paper is based on a research you did with your co-author on resource abundance. And we're going to be talking about it.
Great.
But before we do so, I will be listing your findings. Finding one, natural resources generally have a positive direct effect through the economic channel and a negative indirect effect through the institutional channel. Why is this so?
Great question. So yeah, the paper that we reference in the Brookings blog post is part of a wider agenda that I have on trying to understand natural resources, resource-led development, resource curse, and some other aspects of natural resource extraction, including company community relationships. So this particular paper tries to understand the difference between what we term resource dependence and resource abundance. And we're not the first to make this distinction. But broadly, you can think of resource abundance as the amount of stuff in the ground per person divided by the population. So there are some countries that just happen to sit on a lot of valuable natural resources, and there are some that don't sit on so many resources. So that's sort of one measure. And you can think that that might be a great thing to have. Like imagine if you're on a personal level, you're going along, you're working your way through school, and then you just happen to come across a couple $100,000. Like that could be utilized. Say, I'm going to make this a down payment for my first apartment purchase, and I'm going to pay off my student loans, and then that enables you to go ahead and work on your most high impact stuff. And that's the same that we find for countries. Basically, this having resource abundance or having stuff in the ground, assuming you've got everything else in order and lined up, can be a real blessing. And that money can be utilized for basically investing in human capital and infrastructure. And even in some countries like Norway, most famously, it can be saved for the benefit of retiring or for future generations. Now, the other side of this is resource dependence. And that's when a country has natural resources, but it might not have a ton of natural resources, but as a share of its economy, it can be quite high. And with every fraction, there's a numerator, the number on top, which would be the natural resources, and then there's the denominator, which in this case would be the whole economy for different measures of it. And if that number is really high, the fraction of the economy that's devoted to natural resources, then that can be of two drivers, right? One is that there's a lot of resources, which would make the fraction high. And the other is that there's not a lot of anything else. And most countries that are heavily dependent on natural resources just don't have a lot of other things going on. And so in those cases, resource dependence would show up as almost all of the country's exports are a natural resource. Or almost all of or not even almost all, but a good fraction of the government's revenue comes from taxing the extraction of natural resources. Or the more sort of, I guess, technical measures like the share of resource rents in GDP are very high. And basically what we found in that paper is if you just look at resource abundance of the amount of stuff per person, it has pretty good predictive effects. But if you look at resource dependence, then it doesn't look so good. And then the main channel that we identify is that the more dependent the economy is on natural resources, the worse the quality of so-called institutions are. And when that institutional quality is low, then we see more effects of the resource curse that shows up in poorer development outcomes. And so the basic idea is that being dependent on natural resources leads to worse institutions, which leads to bad outcomes.
Let's consider the examples of Canada and the Republic of Congo. And this is what you wrote some time ago. According to World Bank data, The two countries have the same levels of natural resource endowment, with resource rents per capita of around $1,200 as of 2013. The contribution of resources to GDP, however, was much larger in Congo than in Canada. While both countries can be considered resource abundant, only Congo can be said to be truly dependent on resources.
That's what we use to try to make that distinction tangible. And so when we think of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, at least those of us who have interest in global development and in outcomes in Africa and reducing poverty and ending poverty traps, the natural image of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a so-called resource curse state. One, it's really rich in natural resources. There's copper in the southeast. There's coltan, that's utilized in high-tech stuff in the east. There's oil in the southwest. There's even diamonds, and so it seems like the classic resource-rich country. But as we point out in that piece, Canada's resource-rich as well, but Canada also manufactures lots of other things. And so when you have that situation where there's a lot of resources, but not much else in the ground, the whole political economy shifts and takes on a different aspect. I mean, to be sure, and I'm speaking to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, where I wouldn't say that Canada has been spared by the challenges of governing and developing when you have natural resources. There's plenty of folks in the manufacturing and tech sectors who probably wish that oil was never exploited in Alberta, because when the price of oil goes up, Canada's exchange rate pushes up, and then suddenly these car manufacturers in Southern Ontario find themselves much less competitive relative to their American counterparts. Whereas when the price of oil is low, suddenly they're a bargain in that local value chain. And similarly, from our tech sector here, when our exchange rate is weaker in Canada, the relative cost of tech workers in Vancouver and Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal is much cheaper. But if the price of oil pushes up, then it becomes more expensive, and companies are less likely to open up offices here. So Canada is definitely not immune to this. But the difference is that a lot of the political economy in the Democratic Republic of the Congo revolves around those rents that flow from natural resource extraction, and that can lead to a bunch of negative outcomes, including conflict, corruption, bad government, and the lack of development of economic diversification.
Erik, apparently you were discussing the Dutch disease. Would you like to tell us a little about the Dutch disease?
Sure. Yeah, so the Dutch disease comes from the discovery of natural gas by the Netherlands in the 1960s. And basically what happens, you're going along, you're producing the stuff that you produce, and then you discover a new natural resource. And suddenly it becomes, the extraction of that becomes more economically profitable than the other stuff. So more capital goes into it. Doesn't mean your other stuff is not profitable, but it's going to attract new capital and new production. And now you're exporting more. So that means that there's more demand from the rest of the world for your currency, which pushes up the price of your currency. And then the other stuff that had been priced at a certain level, like in the case of Canada, 80 US cents per Canadian dollar, suddenly gets pushed up maybe to $1 per dollar. And now it becomes less competitive. And so that's one aspect of it, is on the export side. But then there's sort of a flip side, which is that, so now you're producing and selling your natural resource, makes your other exports less competitive. And now the so-called non-tradable sectors of the economy become relatively more expensive, because the imported stuff is going to become cheaper when the currency of a country goes up. But what doesn't become cheaper is buying real estate or getting a haircut or going out to a restaurant. And so those non-tradables become more expensive. And now when new workers are considering entering the labor market, they're going to be more likely to go into the resource sector, which is often very small and capital intensive from an employment perspective, and in these non-tradable sector. Now, the non-tradables aren't, they're not subject to the rigor of global competition. And so it's much more likely that a country can sort of lose in overall productivity gains in the medium run while they're having heyday in the natural resource export, but it can lead to lower productivity growth across the economy.
Erik, have you ever thought about living in a developing country?
I have, and never for a very long time, but I guess my initial experience was as a high school student doing an exchange program in Sao Paulo, where I spent a year in Brazil. And then I've also, I spent 2 of my summers in graduate school living in Uganda, and then in Liberia a similar amount of time, as well as lots of back and forth doing policy advising in Liberia.
Oh, yes, I did see Liberia attached to one of your posts. I raised the question because living in a developing country can be comfortable if you are relatively middle class or even upper working class in a developed country, since the cost of living in developing countries is inexpensive. The problem is that people are poor.
Yeah, I agree.
So I live in a developing country, and people like to complain about the rising cost of living, but I often remind them that they are poor people. So if you were to study abroad, you're going to spend over 30 grand a year. You can get a degree for over 2 grand in Jamaica a year.
Yeah. Where
But
do you
people are,
live?
I live in Jamaica.
Oh, wow, that's wonderful. I've never visited.
Yeah, so even fine dining in Jamaica is really cheap, and I keep repeating the point on the show. I've done so on a number of occasions. You could not eat at an equivalent restaurant in the States. That would just be way too pricey.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, so the developing countries are in a bind. The cost of living is inexpensive. If their economies start to grow too rapidly, it will have a negative impact on balance of payments and further inflate living costs, as we just explained with the Dutch disease.
Yeah, and then I think there's an additional problem with that, which is that sort of costs are lower in developing countries broadly, which is true, but there's differences across developing countries. So, for example, when I've traveled in Southeast Asia, your $5 meal gets you goes a lot farther than a $5 meal in Africa, and that difference as the experience of a traveler, or a hotel or a tourist experience or something like that. As a tourist, you can experience those differences, but that also translates to the country's export productivity. And so it's much cheaper to make something in Thailand and to build it than it is in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And then you add transport costs. Like Zambia is a landlocked country. It's rich in natural resources. Or Zimbabwe, its neighbor, which has a huge tradition of rich human capital and some nice infrastructure, but the cost of getting your stuff to the port is so high. So one, it might be expensive to make as compared to Thailand or Vietnam, and the other, it's much more expensive to move. So that could be an additional barrier to diversification when those relative costs are higher than in other places.
So if imports become cheaper, then countries will demand more. So when poor countries receive an influx of resources, their demand will increase. But I said that it will adversely affect balance of payment because poor countries are not rich enough to afford deficits. So if you're a poor country and you begin to import more goods and services, you're going to lose money over the long term. So in a rich country like Singapore or the United States, people will argue that trade deficits are associated with employment, and that deficits are not bad because the gains of trade are greater than the deficit. But in a poor country like Jamaica, yes, the gains of trade are greater than the deficit, but when a country is not rich, to the average person, imports are bad.
Yeah, that's true. But then I guess I guess I would maybe step back and say, what's driving the balance of payments deficit? Because something has to pay for it. So one source one driver of new imports would be new exports. And if that's coming from the natural resource, then that wouldn't necessarily affect the balance of payments in a negative direction, but it certainly could affect what gets consumed on the street and the relative mix of imports versus domestically produced stuff, because what might have used to be produced in tradable goods is now just being produced in the resource sector, and then imports are coming in and pushing out domestic production. But in other countries, there really is a deficit, and it might be paid for through borrowing or through foreign aid, or through some other, or through remittances of, Jamaicans living in greater New York City and sending money home. And each of those can kind of have, I would totally agree with you, a different and possibly deleterious effect on the domestic economy.
Yes, because remember, the gains of trade are greater than the deficit. But when you're living in a poor country, people complain about hospital, healthcare, and roads. We have a litany of complaints. And then with new wealth, there's increased demand for imports. You can't justify the deficit when you're a politician in a poor country. What do you say to the people? In a rich country, a completely different scenario.
Yeah, that's true.
And back to your point about exports, if the resource scarce has the potential to degrade the quality of institutions, this can affect export productivity.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And back to your earlier point, let's say I've just discovered oil and gas, and then a new investment has come in. So that might, that's bringing investment that can finance the trade deficit. Often that initial deficit is just building stuff, like for the extraction or sale of the resource. But then once you get that flow of oil going on, the government or even private sector actors will find it easier to borrow. So that could mean once they get the resource, they borrow abroad. And so they're already spending more from resource taxation. And now they can borrow even additional stuff, because now their balance sheet looks very good, because they've got this, this stream of resources that they can tax going forward. And so that can lead, ironically, to a worse public finance situation of running deficits than before the resource was even discovered in the first place.
Perverse incentives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Depending on one's orientation, resources can compel a state to become more prudent, or it can engage in wanton spending.
Yeah.
And for most countries lacking proper institutions and adequate human capital, the answer is wanton spending. Botswana, however, is always an exception.
There are always exceptions.
Yes, but yeah. Botswana.
Botswana, yes.
Yes, Botswana is always an exception. There's a paper arguing that the Dutch disease did not affect Botswana.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think we like to say Botswana is the exception that proves the rule for much of these general findings in sub-Saharan Africa. Botswana has done a terrific job of through a set of reasons, but broadly it's resulted in a pretty significant amount of discipline, fiscal discipline, where the resource revenue that comes from their interest in diamonds, as well as the taxation of it, Botswana has done a terrific job of investing in the priorities of national development. So they've got these 5-year development plans, and then with respect to the diamonds, there's 2 sources of government revenue. One is that they're in these joint ventures with De Beers and the diamond miners, so that they're an equity stakeholder in that. And then the other is they get to tax it as if they were just the regular revenue authority. So they're getting money from the diamonds in a couple different ways, and then they're investing it in the priorities. And it's just been a fantastic run over many decades, leading to significant growth and development. But even Botswana has had challenges diversifying their economy.
I call it impartial management. I say impartial management because we don't want the government to discriminate. We want government policies to be indiscriminate, and the government of Botswana has been mature enough to implement politics by not inflating political scandals
Hmm.
and negative incentives.
Yeah, I guess you could, observers might say politics is boring in Botswana, which could be a good thing.
Yes, yeah, politics should be boring. Like my suggestion for Jamaica is to have a prime minister and a cabinet. Not we shouldn't have members of parliament or councillors. Instead of complaining about the performance of MPs and councillors, just get rid of them. We already have government agencies.
Hmm.
Yeah, politics should be boring. When politics is boring, we can govern the country.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, I view politics as a distraction. So I respect entrepreneurs. I find it difficult to respect politicians. What do they create? Many of them are just hot air.
Yeah, or even that might be true, but then let's assume you're different and you want to make a difference. It's a complex environment to go into if many of the other politicians are there for personal reasons or or for just creating a power base to exploit it for other reasons. And then if you go in with good intentions, those are the folks you're going to have to make deals with and political compromises with to get things through. And so it's probably it's difficult to cleanly operate in that environment and not become a part of that system.
Well, we can always go to Denmark or Switzerland or Sweden or Singapore.
That's right. Just not in certain periods of history, because
Yeah. Not,
they've had to have a lot of rough periods to get to
yes,
the models where they're at.
it's a bit strange that so many people are not familiar with the history of Sweden, but Sweden once had an empire. Yeah. Yes.
Well, we all know about the Vikings.
Yeah. Sweden once had an empire, and there's a new paper I'm planning to read on mercantilism in Sweden. But the moment when Sweden matured, it did not revert to the old normal.
Yeah, no, the amount of kind of the broad social agreement in the Nordic countries is pretty extraordinary.
Now we're going to talk about your third finding. The effect of resources on development tends to differ between physical and human capital development outcomes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess the easiest way to understand this would be it's the easiest way to spend resource revenue is on physical stuff, because it's just a question of money coming in and then infrastructure or other physical investments being purchased. Whereas human capital is a bit more complicated, because that's ultimately a personal decision. Do I go to university or not? And that's going to depend on the rewards, the returns on education. If I go to university and I get an increase in salary, regardless of whether it's expensive or not, or whether there's resources in the ground or not, if I can finance that, then I'm gonna go for it. And so, but if the presence of natural resources doesn't automatically result in a dynamic economy, then that decision on whether to go to pursue education is not going to be as appealing. So I think that's the broad thing. It's more it can certainly lead to more economic opportunity, but on the flip side, that those incentives are much easier to spoil through some of the resource curse dynamics.
Erik, what drives successful economic diversification in resource-rich countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Adisu Lashitu and I, who's the co-author on the Brookings piece and the related research, he's at McMaster now, as well as Michael Ross at UCLA, have a research agenda trying to understand economic diversification. Broadly, I guess we find there's a couple reasons that make diversification challenging in places that are dependent on natural resources. And I divide those into two categories. One is economics. So first, we talked about Dutch disease, which might make the currency more expensive and other areas of economic activity more expensive. But then there's a couple other pieces. One is just the volatility. So let's say you're trying to make other stuff, but because of the natural resources, the economy is going to go through these huge boom and bust cycles. And unless there are safeguards in place, then even the government spending, which is normally supposed to push against, which is normally supposed to be help out during periods of recession and to sort of pull back the reins during periods of boom, that can be exacerbated. So just like we talked about, if resource prices are high, then government revenue is high, then it's more likely to be spending on new projects. And like I said earlier, they might even borrow on top of that. So you have this, the economy just goes for a wild ride, which makes, like, let's say you're just making something simple like copper wire. Now, if you're involved in that, then suddenly you're kind of riding this roller coaster ride that the economy is going on. So that's just much more difficult. And the third economic piece comes from research by Ricardo Hausmann and colleagues at the Harvard Center for International Development, which is what they call the product space. And the product space, you can imagine, is just all the stuff you can make. And they have this neat way of mapping everything you can make based on how related it is to other things. So an example of two things that are really close together on the product space would be you make t-shirts, and then a lot of countries that make t-shirts also make long sleeve shirts. And countries that make long sleeve shirts often make pants. And so those products seem to be very close together on the product space. And in terms of the logic or the theory of economic diversification, the reason you might imagine that is because the same capabilities and underlying kind of economic characteristics that allow you to produce t-shirts will also likely to be allow you to produce long sleeve shirts. Now, so you map the product space of all this stuff in a country. You've got, garments over here, and you've got electronics over there, and then you have cars and stuff here, and that's related to robots and capital manufacturing. And way out on its own is oil and gas, and way out on its own over here is mining activities. And so, in other words, if you're making something in the resource sector, let's say you have offshore oil and gas, you can't just jump from that to making cars because the underlying capabilities of the economy are so different. And so that's another reason why it's economically hard to diversify. Now, if you're Canada, and your resource development has occurred at the same pace as the manufacturing development, helped by its proximity to the US, of course, but also a larger domestic market, then you have those capabilities for other reasons. So being able to diversify, when Canada diversifies, it's not from oil sands in northern Alberta. It's more likely from the manufacturing and service centers in southern Ontario and Quebec, and then the big cities across the country. So that's sort of the economic reasons why it's hard to diversify. And then there's also political reasons. We haven't talked about this a lot, just sort of alluded to it. But if you're in a resource-dependent country, think Democratic Republic of the Congo, how do you regulate, and you're in the government there, how do you regulate the private sector? You're not actually necessarily, other than a handful of really well-intentioned and probably very talented bureaucrats who are trying to enable the development of new industries. But for the classic political incentive in that environment is you're governing the private sector, not for economic growth, but for the political survival of your regime. And so what does that mean? That means you've got revenue flowing to the state from the resource production, and that money then comes into the government, and it can be recycled in different ways. And much of that is around the distribution of rents or business opportunities, or so-called crony firms, to enable the political allies of the government, or even sometimes members of the family, to benefit. And then those businesses will then direct their additional profits that they make above and beyond the initial resource taxation back to help the party or government or individual politicians remain in power. And so what does that mean? If you've got, first you have resources, and then you have a bunch of companies that are kind of benefiting from their proximity to power, those companies are likely to be in the non-tradable sector. So in other words, they're not competing with businesses from Thailand and Vietnam, but only with other businesses inside of the DRC. And how do you compete well with other businesses inside of the DRC? If your goal is, if you're just giving these opportunities to buddies, and the answer is you have to give them protection at the same time. So then these firms become protected from competition, which means reducing competition, which means raising barriers to entry. And so that's naturally going to slow the diversification of the economy. If you're creating barriers to entry for more dynamic private sector firms that don't have these political competitions, then you kind of have a less productive private sector. And now let's say you're in a third industry, and now you need to buy power, or you need to buy transportation equipment, or utilize infrastructure from one of these crony firms. Well, do you think those firms have a high cost basis or a low cost basis? For sure, they're going to be high, because they're using part of these so-called clientelistic networks to reward political supporters as opposed to generate productivity. So you basically have this kind of vicious cycle where the politics creates a really expensive and politically connected business class, which makes it even that much harder for a business that would just like to enter a new product or service to be successful. It just can't compete.
Yes, this is the obvious conclusion of the resource curse. It results in some firms becoming so powerful that they're insulated from production, and this leads to further economic impoverishment.
Yeah.
So Erik, speaking to you has been a pleasure, but unfortunately I have to wrap up these days. I am planning to do shorter shows, and actually I'm a bit infuriated because I wanted to speak for a longer time about the economic complexity index, since you mentioned Ricardo, but unfortunately I just have to wrap up. But we can continue the conversation via email.
Sounds great. Well, it's been a pleasure to chat with you, and look forward to our future conversation.
Yes, bye Erik.
Okay, bye-bye.